Hey everyone, it is late at night and I'm Norman. Tonight we're going to be discussing something that other watch nerd/enthusiasts discuss or at least mention frequently. I have myself. However, I thought it would be good to do a video and bring the receipts. So we all have differing tastes in watches, and this includes watch case sizes. And throughout history, trends in watch case sizes have evolved. Kind of a continuous march into bigger and bigger case sizes. I mean, if A11s were produced today, there is no way they would be considered anything but a lady's watch. However, in researching this video, and by the way, all of my sources are in the show notes below, I realized that this trend toward larger case sizes is not exactly what we think it is. Wristwatches have been with us for over a century. The mechanics behind them remain largely unchanged, with refinements like shock absorption introduced in 1934 with the creation of the Inca block system, and there are others now. However, originally watches were considered a woman's accessory, until the utilitarian needs of war came into the picture. Early watches were nothing more than pocket watches strapped to the wrist until 1904. In 1904, Brazilian aviator Alberto Santos Dumont collaborated with his friend Louis Cartier, the famous French watchmaker, to design and create a timepiece for the wrist that could be easily read while flying. Something that wasn't so clunky and awkward as a pocket watch, which Dumont hated to keep having to pull out of his pocket in flight. Thus, the Cartier Santos was born, and the official birth of a new era in timepiece design, the wristwatch. However, it wasn't until World War II that men's wristwatches really became a thing. When America joined the war, the A11 specification was created, and soldiers were issued timepieces that adhered to this A11 specification. A hacking movement. This allowed the seconds hand to be stopped, enabling soldiers to synchronize watches precisely, a crucial feature for coordinated military operations. A high contrast dial. The black dial, combined with luminous hands and numerals, ensured readability even in low light and nighttime conditions. Durable construction. While cases varied between stainless steel and chrome-plated brass, the watch was built to withstand the rigors of war. Standardized design. The US military enforced specifications that made the A11 a benchmark for wartime watches. It included a manual winding 15-jewel movement for reliability. Canvas straps. Functional, military-style canvas straps offered comfort and the ability to replace them easily when damaged. 3 American watch manufacturers, Elgin, Waltham, and Bulova, were contracted to make the watches. Though despite being an American production standard produced by American companies, the A11 also saw service in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, under the 6B/234 designation, the RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Soviet Air Force. Both unloomed and loomed versions of the watch were produced, with the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics specially requesting a fully loomed version, which was given the designation FSSC 88-W-800. And one article that I came across had an example of how syncing your watches might go. England, 1945. A nighttime briefing of U.S. Army Air Force's personnel is in session, prepping the flight officers and enlisted men with details on target, weather conditions, aircraft, payload, and more. just one thing remains. "Gentlemen," begins the briefing officer, "the time on my command will be exactly 2100 hours. The men wait for the seconds hand on their government-issued A11 watches to line up exactly with 12, and then pull out the crowns and set the time to 2100. They wait for the command to proceed." "Hack," says the briefing officer. The men simultaneously push the crowns on their watches, all perfectly synchronized to the second, to 2100 hours. "Good luck," he continues. "Now go bomb Berlin." And these were really small watches at 32 millimeters. However, when the soldiers returned home wearing them, the public's opinion of men wearing watches completely changed. As time marched on, however, the idea of what a men's watch should be continued to evolve. Let's explore some commentary on watch case sizes throughout history. But again, stick around until the end because we're gonna go deeper. And it's a bit crazy. So a blog to watch put out a piece called The Evolution of Watch Case Sizes, and they had this to say about the 1970s. Ironically, the Japanese quartz explosion didn't get very creative with watch design. They kept the same tire designs of the mechanical, round, square, rectangle, 32 to 34 millimeter. The one interesting blip came from the digital companies like Pulsar. The Pulsar digital watch, although it had a rectangular shape, bore no resemblance to the watches of the past. And I can honestly say, it was the low point in watch design, although some people thought it was a fantastic design, probably the same people who thought polyester leisure suits looked fashionable. And then nothing really happened until the mid-1980s, when something very unusual transpired. Cartier released a watch that was big. Not just big, 38 millimeters big. This was a very important concept for the modern watch experience. The bigger the watch, the bolder the statement. Up until this time, the average watch size in round cases was 32 to 34 millimeters. With the realization that the public could buy oversized watches, the watch companies realized that they had a whole new, very receptive audience to sell to. They could sell their existing designs in big sizes. You can see, pictured at the right side, a man's Cartier Santos in round from the 1980s, 32 millimeters. But next to the 100-year anniversary Santos, 42 millimeters, it looks like a woman's version. And using an article that I found on Becker Time, we can kind of trace the evolution of watch case sizes from the very beginning, the 1910s. Yet even though the Santos could conceivably be called the first tool watch, it would take the arrival of the First World War to truly cement the new innovation's status. When these servicemen returned home, still sporting the pieces on their arms, it transformed the image of the wristwatch from a purely female accessory to one suitable for even the manliest of men. However, between the extremely reserved nature of the time and the fact that the movements were usually taken directly from women's so-called pendant watches, these men's models generally measured only between 27 to 30 millimeters in diameter. The 1920s. The Roaring Twenties marked the start of the wristwatch's first real golden age. The Art Deco and Bauhaus movements dominated styling principles and gave rise to an era-defining look. Nowhere is that better encapsulated than in another creation by Louis Cartier, the tank. Inspired by the tracks of the Renault tanks he had witnessed on the Western Front in World War I, the achingly luxurious styling epitomizes Art Deco's ornate approach. But even though the brand released a number of different versions in the space of a few short years, the Normale came out first, quickly followed by a host of others, such as the Cintre, the Tank Louis, etc. They were all particularly small by today's standards, with anywhere between 26 and 31 millimeters the norm. Even the sharply elongated cintre, French for curved, only measured a maximum of 47 millimeters, top to bottom. But its rounded case, formed to hug the wrist, and coupled with a width of just 23 millimeters, meant that the whole watch looked rather like a continuous bracelet. The 1940s. Even though Switzerland was officially neutral during World War II, their watchmaking industry at the time was heavily influenced by the military. But with some famous exceptions, many of these models were still relatively small. The A11, for instance, made by Elgin, Bulova, and Waltham, and known in some circles as the watch that won the war, was only a 32mm piece. Of course, some wartime occupations needed something a little bigger. The initial hints of these new, almost unrealistically huge models actually started before the war, with brands such as Panerai. Their radio mirror watch, utilizing a revolutionary luminescent material on the dial called radium, was being supplied to the country's Navy divers from as early as 1936. The hand-wound movements and enormous 47mm waterproof cases were both made by Rolex. The 1950s. In 1945, the Datejust launched. It was the watch that really put Rolex on the map, but recognizing that its surprisingly large, for the time, 36mm case may have been putting off potential buyers of both sexes, the 1950s was the decade that introduced the 34mm Date and the 26mm Lady Datejust. Later they would also add a 31mm mid-size to cover all the bases. And the 1950s saw the rise of tool watches. These were designed to be worn in rugged situations and simply tell time. Even so, not many of these early tool models broke the 40mm barrier. The debut references of some of the most famous of all time, the Rolex Submariner and GMT Master, the Omega Speedmaster and Seamaster, all stayed at or below 39mm. Certainly big by the standards of the day, but by no means excessive. The 1960s. 36mm became far more acceptable for dress models, while sports pieces were now 40mm as a minimum. The evolution of the wristwatch was such that it was suddenly more than ever before something to show off as a display of identity. Rather than being hidden away, they became statements. The 1970s. Hamilton brought out the Pulsar, measuring just 34mm across. Seiko later unveiled the first 6-digit LCD watch, the LCVFA 06LC, which was less than 30mm. The 1980s, the age of excess. Although the 36 and 38mm space was still considered the top end for most formal pieces, there was a certain amount of experimentation and rulebook ripping as far as tool watches were concerned. Firms like Breitling and the recently taken over Tag Heuer started introducing some especially large models, such as the latter's Formula 1, which could be had in a 44mm version. Omega's latest in the Speedmaster series, the Mark V, measured the same. And even some of the so-called Holy Trinity jumped on board, with Audemars Piguet bringing out a 42mm example of their Royal Oak, a model which had stayed mostly sub 40mm until then. The 1990s. The 1990s actually brought with it some of the largest watches ever made for general sale. What we now describe as oversize. The likes of Italian brand U-Boat debuted pieces such as their U-1942, which was a ridiculous 64.4mm wide. Average sizes across the more well-known brands started to creep up as well. Overall, it was hard to find any sports watch smaller than 40mm, with 41 to 43mm now the standard. So commentary like this is typically what you'll find in most articles or videos or podcasts on the subject, where a specific model or two will be brought up. But I came across an interesting website called Golddammer. And what's amazing about the articles that they put out is they are very data heavy, with charts and graphs and all the things. And they wrote an article called "When Did Watches Start Getting So Big?" We do see that generally over the past 80 or so years, case sizes tend to go up on the average. But one interesting point is that this increase is not happening gradually over all possible diameter levels. There are case diameters that seem to be the norm, namely 34, 35, 36, and 40, all of which are peaking at different times in the late 50s, mid 40s, 1980s, and during the late 20th century, respectively. We see a very interesting trend between the mid-1960s until the late 1970s. Chronograph as well as dive watches dramatically increase in size, all in all by about 5 millimeters. And with the beginning of the 1980s, they're down again by about -3 millimeters. That's the first evidence we got that fashion can actually be the driving force behind the case outlines. Not utility, not technological swagger. And what about the masculinity angle? I'd argue strongly against the masculinity aspect. Women's watches are no longer exclusively petite. Iconic models from Cartier, for example, are still rather small, but so are the men's counterparts. Additionally, most best-selling fashion-style watches for women, Fossil, Michael Kors, etc., range far into the 40+ millimeter range. Not what the typical watch enthusiast is looking for, but what the average person might be interested in. So in looking at their data, watch case sizes definitely continue to trend larger and larger, but that's kind of overall, and in specific areas, like sports watches. Where it gets interesting is with the dress watches. And I would like to know exactly what types of pieces they're looking at for all of this data, because I'm wondering if maybe dress style tank watches aren't shoving down the dress watch case size numbers. Because I mean, if you go to a luxury AD, the dress watches really are not small, for the really spendy pieces at least. But it's really cool seeing the hard data versus just the overall impression and feeling that we have. Be sure to check out all the articles that I've linked in the show notes below, and thanks for watching.